The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, and their subsequent declaration of war on the United States as well as Britain and her Commonwealth was accompanied at the same time and in ensuing days by a series of attacks on smaller American, British, and Commonwealth islands across the Pacific. While many American battles such as those fought over the Philippines, Guam, and Wake Island have been well documented in modern history, the British, Australians, and their Commonwealth allies played a crucial role in defense against and eventually the defeat of the Japanese Empire. In today's video, we will cover how one small group of Australian and British servicemen managed to carry out one of the most daring raids of World War II. The massively overlaid Japanese fishing boat Kofofu Maru motored slowly across Sumatra, carrying the last of more than 1,100 refugees she had helped ferry from Singapore while fleeing the invading Japanese. Little did her captain, Australian merchant seaman Bill Reynolds, know that within a few days, his escape from Singapore and the observations he made along the way would lead to the creation of one of the most audacious operations to be carried out during World War II. After arriving in Sumatra, Reynolds met Captain Ivan Lyon of the Allied Intelligence Organization, a British officer and fellow escapee from Singapore. During 2 weeks spent rescuing refugees and survivors of ships sunk by the Japanese, Reynolds observed that he and the Kofofu Maru had been spotted multiple times by Japanese surface forces and aircraft. Despite engaging other nearby vessels, they completely ignored the old Japanese fishing boat, allowing Reynolds to sail past enemy combatants unnoticed. Reynolds mentioned this during his conversation with Captain Lyon, and the two began to hatch a plan to enact revenge for the atrocities that had been committed against the Singaporeans. However, the Japanese swiftly captured the Dutch East Indies in mid-March 1942, forcing Captain Lyon to flee to Australia and Reynolds to flee to Ceylon, modern-day Sri Lanka, aboard Kofofu Maru. Shortly after the Dutch East Indies fell, the Allies created Special Operations Australia, a combined Allied military intelligence organization, in mid-March 1942. Z Commando Unit, generally known as Z-Force, was organized in June 1942, with Major Lyon now taking command of a 14-man team. Lyon's unit comprised 11 Australians and 3 British officers. Major Lyon planned to use the Kofofu Maru, a Japanese fishing boat that he later renamed Krait after a deadly Australian snake, to sneak his commandos close to Singapore Harbor before offloading a group of 6 men into small foldable 2-person canoes. These 6 men would then paddle into the harbor during the night and attach limpet mines to moored Japanese ships, escaping undetected. He named the operation Operation Jaywick. The group began training for the raid at Refuge Bay, New South Wales, which they renamed Camp X. The men were eager to fight and highly capable. However, only 2 foldable boats were available on Australia for their training, one of which held a single person only. Additionally, the Krait had to go from Sri Lanka off India to Australia through a Pacific now dominated by the Imperial Japanese Navy. Krait made 2 separate attempts at her journey, but her engines died both times, necessitating her transportation on the deck of an Australian cargo vessel. A replacement engine was sourced in Hobart, Tasmania, but it took additional time to transport and install. As a side note, Bill Reynolds, in his 50s at this point, joined the clandestine Civilian Bureau of Economic Warfare. Fluent in Malay and Chinese, he was dropped by the American submarine Tuna in the Strait of Makassar to collect information from local spies. He was betrayed to the Japanese, undergoing months of torture before he was eventually executed. While Major Lyon's division of Force Z was training, a separate group from the force led by Lieutenant Samuel Carey made a mock raid on Townsville Harbor on June 23rd. They managed to mine 15 Allied ships, shocking Naval Command in the process but also proving Jaywick's potential efficacy. In mid-1943, the group traveled 2,400 miles from Cairns, Australia, to Thursday Island and then Exmouth Gulf on August 13th, where they took fuel from the damaged tanker MV Ondina. The foldaboats they had ordered for the raid were found to be largely defective. Modifications had to be made at this time to ensure that they fit together and work correctly, further delaying the crew's training time. They left for Singapore on September 2nd. The small ship, massively overloaded with men and supplies, was almost immediately overtaken by a massive storm, setting her decks awash and forcing the men to chop a hole in her side to help drain seawater. Anonymity was crucial for their survival, so the men took great care to blend with native fishermen. For this reason, they painted their skin brown and wore local ethnic clothing. In a time when garbage was often thrown overboard, they were even careful to only dispose of waste not produced in Europe to prevent detection from their trash. The Krait, not the most reliable transportation mode, suffered a broken propeller shaft during her transit. Still, a passing American submarine luckily repaired her. After a harrowing 16-day journey during which they miraculously evaded detection, the Krait disembarked the 6 Commandoes just off the coast of Penjang Island. They then island hopped for 3 days before landing on a small island roughly 8 miles from the harbor. They attempted to raid the harbor, but were driven back by adverse tides. After moving to a more advantageous position, the men spent the night contemplating the incursion set for the following day. In particular, 3 of them had relatives held on the island as prisoners of war. This included Lyon, whose wife and infant son were imprisoned after the ship they were using to escape Singapore had been sunk. On the night of September 25th through the 26th, the men paddled into the harbor intent on completing their mission. No blackout measures had been taken in Singapore, and Japanese patrols were minimal because of the Japanese complacency in the region. The first group, Lieutenant Robert Page and able seaman Arthur Jones, first spotted a large freighter, the 5,071-ton Kazan Maru, placing limpet mines along her hull. They also managed to mine the 2,200-ton ocean liner Hakusan Maru and Nasusan Maru, a 4,400-ton fleet oiler. They were spotlighted several times in the harbor, but no alarms were raised. The second group, comprised of Donald Davidson and Wally Falls, paddled into Kepler Harbor and was almost run down by a Japanese ferry. After evading it and passing the busy Empire Dock, they paddled into Singapore's business sector. Here they set mines on the Nishiran Maru, a 5,460-ton Army auxiliary transport, and the Arare Maru, a 2,770-ton tanker. They also mined a third ship, but it appears that this ship was not damaged during the incident. The third group, comprising Major Lyon and able seaman Andrew Houston, paddled into Examination Anchorage. Unlike most of the harbor, this area was poorly lit. The 2 men sailed for around 2 hours before finally finding the Shosei Maru, a cargo ship of some 5,698 tons, upon which they placed all their mines before leaving the harbor. The boats crewed by Lyon and Houston and Page and Jones paddled back to Dongbas Island. Davidson and Falls elected to paddle straight for Pompong Island for the rendezvous. The 4 men on Dongbas Island had an excellent view of Singapore and heard an explosion at approximately 05:15. 5 more explosions followed over the next 20 minutes. After evading patrols searching for the saboteurs, the men then sailed to Pompong Island, where they expected to meet up with Davidson and Falls. Instead, the exhausted men watched as the krait sailed away with their 2 compatriots. They had landed on the wrong beach. The krait did, however, return 2 days later and pick the 4 men up at the correct beach, a contingency they had planned for. The operation itself was a massive success. While losing no men of their own, the Commandoes had sunk the Arare Maru, the Hakusan Maru, and the Kazan Maru, and badly damaged the Shosei Maru, Michelin Maru, and Nasusan Maru, for a total of nearly 26,000 tons of shipping affected. Not bad for 14 men in a wooden boat. Sadly, the Japanese, as per usual for the time, chose to take revenge on locals and prisoners. They didn't believe anyone could have snuck into their well-guarded harbor, and thus suspected local saboteurs. The Japanese rounded up and tortured 57 civilians and POWs, attempting to force confessions from them. 15 died from the torture. Major Lyon attempted a second, nearly identical raid using a submarine and captured fishing boat later in the war. Sadly, communications breakdowns, as well as chance contact with a Japanese military vessel, would lead to all 23 men, including Lyon, being killed. Lyon did, however, manage to sink 3 ships in the process, with some of the men conducting guerrilla warfare against the Japanese for as long as 4 months. In his last engagement, he and 1 Australian serviceman engaged 100 Japanese soldiers before finally succumbing to shrapnel wounds on October 16, 1944. The Japanese considered those they captured to be spies and brutally executed all of those men as well. 1 group of men from this raid made it 2,000 miles from Singapore to Romang Island, Indonesia, before being captured just a few hundred miles short of Australia. For her part, the krait served the rest of the war as a spy ship, doing reconnaissance on Japanese islands throughout the southern Pacific. After the war, she was sold off and spent the next 20 or so years operating out of Borneo. Finally, in 1964, she was purchased for use as an Australian Royal Volunteer Coastal Patrol vessel. Later that year, she was formally dedicated as a war memorial and eventually put on display at the Australian National Maritime Museum, where she can still be viewed today.